But you've got to step in. You've got to be aware. As a teacher, we cannot just sit at our desk when there's students out there having trouble. We've got to be in there and on their side. It's really important.
Welcome to the BJU Press Teacher Edition podcast, where Christian educators are encouraged and inspired as we bring you interviews, practical ideas, strategies, and answer your questions about teaching in today's culture. And here's your host, Jenny Copeland.
Have you ever had something that consistently made you just nervous or that stressed feeling inside? Maybe as much as you didn't want that reaction and you tried to not let it happen. Your body and your mind, they just don't cooperate. Maybe some of you are thinking about a high cliff or a really tight space that would bother you. Maybe some of you are recalling a really narrow road next to a steep drop off. Maybe even a person to who you just feel like is really intimidating. But for some of our students, it's a subject that brings that same level of anxiety or stress. That feeling of regardless of their diligent work, they can just never quite get on top of that anxiety. How do you help those students? How do you balance sympathizing with them and challenging them? Well, we're going to talk about those topics and more on today's show. But first, welcome to you, our listeners. Thank you for making the Teacher Edition podcast part of your day. As we get started today, just a quick reminder to take a minute and follow the podcast. Wherever you're listening or watching this podcast, just reach up right now and click that follow button. This will keep you notified when a new episode drops in, so you won't miss a single episode. And while you're clicking buttons, could I ask something else of you? If you're enjoying the Teacher Edition podcast, would you also go click on those stars? Leave us a rating, leave us a review. We want every Christian school educator to know about this podcast, and we need your help to do that. By leaving a rating or review, and also by sharing it out with others, we can get the word out. Who would not want a free resource for educators? Educators are all about free, right? So just before we get today's topic rolling, let me remind you also to go visit our website, teachereditionpodcast.com. Go learn more about the show and about our wonderful guests, as well as to leave a question that could be shared on an upcoming episode. You'll also find us on social media, on Instagram and TikTok, we're Teacher Edition Pod, and on Facebook, we are Teacher Edition Podcast. All right, let's jump into today's conversation about a very prevalent topic, math anxiety and how to overcome it. So joining us today is a veteran math teacher. I'm really excited to welcome Pam Litzenberger back to the show. Pam has taught many grades and classes over her 30 plus years of teaching. Pam is currently a national consultant for BJU Press. So she joined us, about a year or so ago to talk about teenagers. That was a really fun conversation. Because of her experience in the math classroom, I just really felt like Pam would have some good insights to really bring to the table on this topic. So Pam, I'm so glad to have you back. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jenny. Glad to be back talking about something that I'm very passionate about with my students. Several years ago, I was asked to do a workshop on math anxiety, to develop that workshop. And as I began talking to my students at the time about math anxiety, I began to notice similarities between how I have felt whenever I would take any kind of test, and began to realize, this is a lot of what I have experienced in my life. And I began putting all that together and developing a workshop on math anxiety to help my students. I found many things that would help my students with math anxiety, but I realized that I get anxious whenever I'm in, like Jenny said, tight situations, a little bit, confined situations, sitting on an airplane between people or things like that, or just taking an assessment. I cannot even describe to you the fear that I have if I have to take a driver's license test. When I grew up, I had to take that when I was 16. I was so scared. When we moved to Texas a few years later, we had to retake the written test, and I was so scared. I studied and studied and studied, and I did fine. But just that anxiousness and that panic that I felt, I began to see that same thing in my students whenever they would get ready for a test. Just a little bit here to describe that. If I were to show you this board.
That makes me anxious.
Yeah, yeah, that problem,
All
and
right, you got me.
that's a pre-algebra problem. That makes many people anxious. I know when I talk to teachers who maybe teach English or history, and I mention something like that, they're like, "Whoa!" But then if I show you this would probably make everyone anxious.
Oh my. Yes, yes. I'm hearing that timer starting and those scratching of pencils and the slamming down when you're done. Oh, yes. It's all
Yes,
coming back to me.
the slamming down when you're done. Ah. But those 2 things I have found make kids so scared of taking a math test, and that's what we wanna talk about today, is why that happens, the symptoms of it, and how we can help our students.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So you've been in thousands of hours of math classes, and I'm
Yeah.
guessing you've really witnessed a lot of angst among some students. You've already
Mhm.
alluded to it a little bit. You gave me anxiety just with those
Yeah.
math problems. Talk with us about a little bit more about your experiences with math anxiety. Why is this something we hear about in academia? Why is this a neon light that keeps popping up? And tell us why you feel we do or don't need to address this topic as Christian educators.
Well, our students, you hear a lot of things about how students are the same as they were years ago, and yes, in some ways they are.
Sure.
But now, and I know a lot of this has to do with COVID and changes in education and social media, kids are different.
Yeah,
And we
for
have
sure.
to treat them differently, and we have to help them to overcome those things that now they have a fear of or that they're anxious about. And so we have to approach things a little bit differently. If you have those speed drills, I remember teaching 5th grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade, and giving speed drills, and it was like, "Here it is, you have 60 seconds, do these problems." And that was very matter of fact. And many kids were fine with that, but then
Sure.
some kids were just, deer in the headlights, and they could not think because of that fear. Nowadays, we have to approach it a little bit differently. And I encourage teachers, don't put so much stress on those things. Um, yes, it's important to be quick and to be accurate, but let's not make those the most important things.
Yeah, for sure. So we've all seen the little student biting the end of the pencil, while trying to recall that math fact, or a student literally just melting down on the desk when not understanding a math concept. What is math anxiety? Like, how would you define it? We talk about it,
Mhm.
but what is it actually?
Well, I have a dictionary definition. I'm going to read it because I can't memorize this. Feelings of tension that interfere with the manipulation of numbers and the solving of problems in a wide variety of ordinary life and academic situations.
I
That
can see why you don't
definition
remember
makes
it.
me anxious.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's
I
get a
would
real definition.
Yeah, I would have to break that down word by word, phrase by phrase to understand it. Typically, math anxiety is a fear, an overwhelming fear when a student has to take any sort of assessment that is going to reflect on their knowledge and their ability. And they're just afraid, even if they are very good at math, and many of these students are very good at math, but that fear of being assessed makes it difficult for them. And then many times they don't do well because of the pressure of that, whether it's from the teacher or that they put on themselves, and sometimes from the parents.
Right. Absolutely. So it's amazing for me to watch how some students have just incredible innate, I guess, math sense, while others try and try, and they just can't seem to make sense of it no matter what they do. How do we decipher where students are? Like how can you really dig into that? And who would you say, I guess, connected to that, who would you say is genuinely affected by math anxiety?
I would say, from what I have seen and the research I have done, that many students, this begins in elementary school.
Hmm.
And it starts with those speed drills. It starts with long multiplication, long division, the stress that causes them having to do all the steps in the right order, learning the facts. Then as they grow, it can get worse and worse and worse.
Sure.
Sometimes it gets better, And I think the teacher holds a lot of power in that,
Sure.
in how the teacher responds to the students and even making some accommodations for the students.
Okay, so understanding what it is and who's affected by it, Pam, in your experience, what are the symptoms of a student with math anxiety? I mean, I'm guessing they show themselves in a whole myriad of ways. We've all seen a few of them, but tell us some of the main ones you've seen.
Probably the main ones that I see with my students, and I taught a lot of my teaching years was middle school. And so I'm getting on the end of elementary when a
Sure.
lot of this is just now coming to bear. Probably kids being sick to their stomach.
Yeah. Yeah.
When they are ready to take a test, they get
A
sick
lot
to
of
their
clinic
stomach.
visits.
Yes, yes. They don't feel good. The number one, I would say, is they have to go to the bathroom. They
Interesting.
immediately they pass out the test. Can I go to the restroom? And I would let them go to the bathroom. Let them take that little break, and then they typically come back feeling a little better, a little more confident. They just had a little bit of a minute or two break. Then some of them will start sweating. um, I know kids say, I'm just nervous. Their heart starts pounding really fast. You can see them sweating. They're fidgeting. But then a lot of kids, they react in a way that says, I don't care. Uh, I don't care how I do on this test. And I think of one particular eighth grade boy I had like this. It was always, I don't care. I give him his test and, I encourage him to study and all those things. And he was always, I don't care. I don't care how I do. I might do okay. I might fail. I really don't care. When I could tell inside, I know this young man cares and I
Yeah.
know his parents
Communicating low
care.
expectation. Yeah.
Yeah. So probably those things, feeling sick, having to go to the bathroom, acting like they don't care, getting nervous, all of those different things. Those are the symptoms that I
Yeah.
have seen.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I definitely, as you list those, you can definitely, brings back memories of seeing that too. So we know that often before we can fix something, or at least help it, let's say it that way, we have to understand what's causing it. Now we've said, okay, it could be a timed test. It could be like, those
Mhm,
are the physical things that we hand them that may be causing
mhm,
it. But what would you say really causes the math anxiety, or I
mhm.
mean, honestly, test anxiety in general among students?
When I'm talking to teachers, sometimes I have to say, "Okay, I might step on toes here, and I'm sorry, but these are things we need to just make ourselves aware
Sure.
of." I think a lot of times, as I was saying earlier, the pressure that in elementary school the teachers put on the kids for those speed drills and that type of thing begins to cause that. Uh, I've also heard of I had students in one year tell me that when they were in one of their elementary classes that they weren't doing very well in long division. And so they did not do well on the test over that chapter. And so the teacher the next week, every night, gave them 30 long division problems to do for
Oh,
homework.
that would make you love it.
And oh my, I just I was trying to control my expressions when
Yeah.
the whole class told me this, and it was a couple of years previous that that had happened, and I could tell it really impacted them, but punishment with math does nothing but make them hate math.
Right,
It
right,
That's not gonna make them do better. What's gonna make them better is the teacher helping them.
right,
And
right.
and and, things like that can cause a kid forever to dislike math.
Sure.
So teachers can cause that in how they deal with the math. Another thing is, and this is one of those kind of hard, is in elementary school, and I was an elementary teacher. I taught third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade. You teach all the subjects, and we all like one subject more than others. And there may be one subject that we really don't like or don't like to teach. And for some teachers, that might be math. For some teachers, it might be English or reading. And so a lot of times, that teacher who doesn't like math or doesn't really want to spend a lot of time on math may downplay the significance of math. Maybe they're
Interesting.
not really good at math, and so they don't stress it and spend as much time and help the students as they should. And
Yeah,
so the
good thought.
students walk away with thinking, well, math's not that important, is it? So,
Yeah, my teacher doesn't
that
even like it.
yeah, if the teacher doesn't like it, I used to, I mean, I love math. I love all the subjects, but math is my favorite. We all have our favorites, that's true. And I would be teaching my students algebra material, things like radicals or polynomials, and my students would tell me, my 8th graders would say, "Mrs. Litz, you really like this stuff, don't you?"
Imagine
And I'm
that.
like, "Yes, I love this stuff. You should love it too. It's okay to be a math nerd." And then they're like, it's like, "Oh, it's okay to like math," because they've never been told that before.
Right, right.
And it's like suddenly, "Oh, it's okay to be a math nerd." So, we just have to make it okay, and we have to make sure we're not stressing one subject over another, turning our kids away from something that they might be really good at.
Right. Yeah, so true. Great thoughts. Okay, so knowing the basics of what causes it, how can we teach our students to cope with that anxiety when it crops up? That's when it gets tricky. Like you said, we start seeing those things happening and they know things are happening in their body. How can we help them cope with that?
Teach them to ask questions. Many kids in a math class, they feel like, I don't understand what she or he is doing, but I don't want to ask question because then they might think I'm not smart. My peers might think, "Oh, you don't get it. What's wrong with you?" And so that peer pressure, and sometimes it might be the teacher. If a student asks a question about something simple, the teacher might give them a facial expression like, "Why don't you get that?" But
Right.
we have to teach our students it's okay to ask questions. I know as teachers, there's so many times when we teach a whole lesson and we've taught it and we feel really good about it. And then we give the students a few problems to do on that, some exercises. And then you have a student who raises their hand and said, "I don't get it." And then you're like, I would always be, "Okay, what part did you not get? Where did you get lost?" And the student says, "I didn't get any of it."
Yeah, just
And
start over.
yes, and that's really hard to take that as a teacher,
Right. It is.
but we have to encourage them to do that. And what
Yeah.
I always told my students was, as soon as you feel like you're not getting it, the second you
Oh,
don't
for sure.
understand, raise your hand and ask, "Miss Litz, can you go back over that part again?" Because if you feel that way, there's probably 3 or 4 other kids who feel that way too,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and they're embarrassed to ask. So just encouraging them to ask questions, teaching them to take notes in math. Now, when you get into like 6th grade, 7th grade, this is really important. Guide them at the beginning of the year how to take notes in math, whether any type of note form is used, a spiral, a 3-ring notebook, however you want them to take notes, so that they practice examples and then they have that to look back at. Also, um, as I was saying, teach them to be active learners, not passive learners. Have them always involved. Ask them questions as you go. Don't wait till the very end of the lesson. Uh, ask this student, ask this student, ask this student. Have them come up to the board. And even those students who maybe have a math deficiency, they struggle at math, maybe they have some sort of accommodation, even those kids, we need to be asking them questions in class. Now, I always encourage teachers, if you have a student like that in your class or several, you may have several nowadays, it's true, make sure it's a question they can answer in front of their peers. As you're walking around, always walking around as you're teaching, make sure they've worked that problem out and they can give you the right answer so that they are not embarrassed because then they'll never try to answer again. Um, so active learners, not passive. Uh, we encourage kids to use afterschoolhelp.com, the BJU Press website. It's a help website for math and English, 4th through 12th grade. I always encouraged my students, um, well, I won't say encouraged. I required them in some chapters that before the chapter test, they had a week where they had to go through all the after school help lessons for that chapter before the chapter test. They could do
Excellent.
it on
Yeah.
their own
Yeah.
time, whenever they wanted to, but that gave them just a review of everything, and that made them more confident.
Sure.
Also, and this happened without me telling kids to, but there were kids who I would go to teach the lesson one day, and I had kids raise their hand to give me the answer before I had even written out the whole problem. And that was because they watched the after school help
Oh,
lesson the
uh-huh.
night before,
Nice.
and that used some of the same examples that I used from the teacher edition. And
Hey,
so
easy to know who did it.
they already worked it out. They thought they were so proud of themselves.
Oh,
But
yes.
having
Yes.
that little preview, like watching a trailer to a movie,
Sure.
you already know kind of what it's about. Um, Other things I would say, encourage self-talk. Whereas the student is working out a problem, um, even if they're doing it at their desk individually, have them to themselves say the steps. Okay, this is a sphere. How do I find the volume of a sphere? This is the formula for volume of a sphere. This is the height. This is the radius. This is all the parts.
Yeah, that's good.
Self-talk instead of just thinking and putting it down. If they go to the board, I used to always have students do this. When they go to the board to work out a problem in front of the class, they have to say all the steps out loud to the class. It's that
Excellent.
verbal, yes, saying of those steps that helps them. But it helps me to see if they understand. It helps all
Sure.
the other students because as they're doing it at their desk, they're like, oh, he said he multiplies. That's what I did wrong. I need to multiply, not divide. So little things like that. Also say a couple of other things. As a teacher, before school starts, hopefully, or before the first couple of weeks, teachers need to go through those students' files in the office. They need to look through that, look at their grades, look at their teacher comments from previous years, look at any information there about any learning differences,
Sure.
find out everything you can about those kids, take notes so that before a problem comes up, you are already aware of a student's difficulty and
Right.
you can assess that and you can deal with that before there's a problem.
Yeah, for sure.
And then lastly in that, I think as teachers, we need to teach kids test taking strategies.
For
How do
sure.
you take
Yes.
how do you take a math test? You take an English test or a history test different from how you take a math test, and there's a ton of strategies out there. Um, and sometimes we have to make some accommodations for some kids. I had one young man in 8th grade where the accommodation that we made was I cut his math test into strips of 2 or
Yes.
3 problems and gave him one of those at a time. There were other students took a pale blue piece of paper, and it's important, pale blue, not neon orange.
Oh, right, right,
That's
yes.
that's been studied, and they would, cover all the questions except the one they were working on. Other things like do all the problems you can do easily first. I've had students who like to work from the bottom question up, and
Oh,
they felt
interesting.
like yeah, because they felt like if I work from the end up, it doesn't stress me when someone else flips their paper
Oh,
over because 'cause
yes.
they're finished the first page. Because
Yeah.
if they all started at the top, it's gonna take me a lot longer to do the first page and everybody else is on the second page, but that way it didn't bother them because
Interesting.
they
Yeah.
they knew they weren't on the same problem. There's a lot of different things that we can use to help those kids that will release some of that anxiety and help them to think more clearly as they take their test.
Yeah, that's really practical. I love that you mentioned taking notes because I think often in math classes, students think, I just sit there and listen. Like, it's not like history where I'm writing down dates or places. So you don't think to take notes in math. I love the taking notes because, again, it gives them another, a hook to hang on when they go to take their tests and the anxiety is cropping up there. It's, oh, yeah, I remember that from my notes. I can see it or I remember writing that down. I also love that you mentioned after school help. I'll do a quick plug for that for all of our listeners.
Please
If you
do.
have not checked out after school afterschoolhelp.com. Go check it out. It is a free resource, basically kind of short videos with some follow-up questions that just reinforce those concepts that have been taught in class. No logins, no connection, anything. Just go in. You can use it in class. You can have your students do it at home. So once again, that's afterschoolhelp.com. I'm so glad, Pam, that you mentioned that.
One of the things about after school help that I found as I used it for several years was the parents thanked me for that. Many parents would say, I watched that with my student so that I could understand how you were teaching it because
Oh,
you
sure.
were
Yeah.
teaching it a little different from the way I learned it 20 years ago. So it's also a help for the parents so that they can then help the kids.
Yeah, that's a great thought. It helps with parental anxiety over math. So that's great. Okay, so often we hear teachers or parents say, if you had done X, this wouldn't be so hard, whether it's a strategy, maybe giving more time or prepared better. Pam, how could we help our students prepare better for their math classes and their math assignments? What can they do to preload this, I guess, and make it a little bit
Yeah.
better when it comes test time?
Okay, so I mentioned the taking notes.
Yes.
And what I encourage teachers to do is use the PowerPoints. With our materials, you have a PowerPoint for every lesson. Edit those PowerPoints to whatever you want them to be, and then teach with those PowerPoints. Have your students write down the problems as you go through explanations on the PowerPoints. They write down those problems, they work them out. I would also suggest, and I did this many times, if you have a student with learning differences, or maybe that student has math anxiety and they just can't get everything written down, print those PowerPoints out. You can
Great
print
idea.
them black and white, 6 on one side, 6 on another side, and smaller, and have the students fill them in. So they're not
Yeah,
having
great idea.
the fear of writing so fast, and then they have that as their notes to study. Then they can
Good
go
thinking.
through those PowerPoints or those notes as they're preparing for a test. Also, they can use example problems from their book to practice. Kids say, "Well, you can't study for math." Yes, you can.
Oh, yes,
You
you
can
should.
you can study. It's how do you study for a basketball game? You practice. How do you prepare for a piano recital? You practice. You go back through examples and practice. And with our secondary textbooks, the math textbooks, most of them have the odd problems answers in the back.
Oh,
And
right.
that's
Yeah,
so students can practice those odd problems and check their answer. And if they do it
yeah.
wrong, they
Great
can go
resource.
back and rework it and make sure they're doing it right. Studying with another person. I can't stress that enough. Practicing with a group. I used a lot of group work in my classes. I loved that. And that takes classroom management
For
skills.
sure.
That's why many teachers don't want to do it. But you can encourage kids to study with another person, go through and practice problems with another person that you can talk to. Many times we say things in a certain way in class and they really don't get it. But when
Right.
another student explains it, it's like, oh, they put it in my words.
Yeah, it's
Now I
amazing how
get
that
it.
works.
Yeah, it is. Um, Sometimes we have to help them make flashcards. We do a lot of flashcards. Flashcards are okay when they're getting down those formulas or other things, vocabulary, some flashcards. I always tell teachers, yes, memorize certain things, but let's teach the math first.
Right.
Let's make sure they understand, with volume, what is the capital H? What is the little h? What is the capital B? What's the little b? Make sure you teach why that formula works before you make them memorize a formula.
Right.
Um, and then graphic organizers.
Oh,
Kids
sure.
are
Yeah.
visual today. Many times they can't learn, like you said, just sitting there listening to the teacher. They need something visual. So I really encourage the use of graphic organizers. There's so many out there that you can find. When I do training in schools, I usually give teachers a couple of examples to keep so that they can, oh, I can copy this and use this, and just
Yeah,
encourage
great
them.
resource.
yeah, come up with your own. There's lots of resources out there to find graphic organizers, but those will help those more visual students to remember those type of things. Acronyms, we all know PEMDAS. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Make some up. Encourage your kids. Okay, we're going to learn this. Let's make up an acronym for this. One year
Should
I
make for
had
an
my
interesting class period.
yes.
Lots of
One year I
creativity.
had my students make up a different one for PEMDAS with the same letter. That was interesting. A couple of years, we did an acronym for the number systems, like irrational,
Oh, yeah.
rational,
Yeah.
all of those. That was good. We made it a competition, and it turned out great. The kids learned.
I'm sure they remembered
And
it.
yeah, so there's all kinds of things like that that you can encourage with your kids to help them.
That's great. Super practical. Things that we can do, things that are cheap, things that are quick. That's great. Okay, so we have only scratched the surface on this topic, but as we wrap up the episode, let's talk about the actual testing time. So you see a student melting down, and we know that that spiral goes south fast. I mean, once they're at overwhelm, they're done. Pam, what are some ways that you can help a student during a test? What are some strategies to help them navigate through that anxiety in the midst of a test?
Well, I tell teachers all the time, probably in every session I do and I work with teachers, I tell them proximity is the best form of classroom
Yeah,
management.
very
And
true.
if you are walking around, not sitting at your desk, walking around, and those students that struggle, you consistently walk by them and just kind of slow down and then maybe tap them on the shoulder and say, "Hey, doing okay? Do you need help on a question? Can I give you a hint? That's okay. Can I give you a hint? You look like you're stuck. Can I give you a little hint?" And a lot of times that's going to relax them a little bit
True.
and just
Yeah.
let them know it's okay.
Yeah,
It's
you're on their
okay if
side. You're not trying to
right,
sink them.
right. We're not just passing out, like you see college classes. You're not
Yeah.
just passing out a test. You're helping them because that's what we're there for in elementary, middle school, and high school. But be there for them. Um, Sometimes kids may need to be isolated a little bit, especially if they have an accommodation that says to isolate them. Maybe they need just a quiet place where there's not other kids, and the kid that's struggling and everybody else is turning in their paper and they're still on number
Yes.
15 and they've got 10 more questions to do. A lot of times they just stop because
Yeah.
they don't want to be the last one to turn in their
Right.
paper.
Right.
So they just stop and go turn their paper in. I've seen that numerous times. And that's when, I give them some more time after school or something like that. But you've got to step in. You've got to be aware. You cannot, as a teacher, we cannot just sit at our desk when there's students out there having trouble. We've got to be in there and on their side. It's really important.
Yeah. Great things to think about. Pam, once again, you brought some great insights to a very far-reaching, wide-reaching topic. So many grades and even into other subjects. So once again, it's been so great to have you on the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. Bye, Jenny.
And to all those of you who are tuning in, thank you for joining us today as well. I hope you were challenged and encouraged as we support these students as they learn. Remember to go to teachereditionpodcast.com to learn more about the show and submit questions for upcoming episodes. Of course, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and go follow us on social media. Now, it's time to get back to your day, but it's not just any day, because every day in the classroom is your day to impact and inspire through God's power and also through His grace working in you. Go do what God has called you to do.